Frau Hauptmann Margaret von Steinberg stared at the hamburger on her plate as if it were a personal insult. A graduate of Berlin's well-known cooking school, a woman who'd managed officers' dining halls across occupied France, she now faced what she considered the ultimate proof of American lack of culture. Ground meat squeezed into a patty and served on bread like street food. The afternoon sun blazed through the windows of Camp Ruston, Louisiana's mess hall, casting harsh light on what Margaret viewed as cooking tragedy. Around her, 40 German women prisoners sat in various states of confusion and disgust. These weren't common soldiers. They were nurses who'd served in field hospitals, radio operators who'd coordinated military communications, administrative officers who'd managed complex supply operations. Many came from educated families, raised in a culture that viewed German cooking as the peak of European excellence. "Ladies," Margaret announced in crisp German, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed, "this is what happens when a nation has no cooking heritage. They feed educated women like we are carnival workers." She pointed at the hamburger with barely hidden contempt. The patty sat between two halves of a soft white bun, topped with lettuce, tomato, onion, and what appeared to be some kind of sauce. To Margaret's trained eye, it looked like something put together in a hurry by someone with no understanding of proper cooking technique. Beside her, Oberleutnant Helga Zimmermann, a former hospital administrator from Dresden, nodded in agreement. "In Germany, we would serve this to factory workers during lunch breaks. Perhaps even then, we would prepare it with more dignity." Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, the American mess hall supervisor, stood near the serving line, watching the German women's reactions with an expression of patient amusement. She was a tall woman in her early 30s, with the kind of practical manner that suggested she'd dealt with difficult situations before. Her uniform was perfect despite the Louisiana heat, and her eyes held something that looked like quiet confidence. "Ladies," Mitchell said in careful, slow English, "I understand this is different from what you're used to, but I encourage you to try it before making judgments. American hamburgers have been feeding families across this country for generations." Margaret understood enough English to catch the meaning, though she pretended otherwise. She turned to the younger women at her table, Nurse Petra Vogel, radio operator Anneliese Weber, and administrative clerk Greta Hoffmann, and spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "The Americans think if they feed us enough, we will forget that we are prisoners. They do not understand that some of us have standards that cannot be compromised by large portions." Several women laughed at this observation, encouraged by Margaret's leadership. Since arriving at Camp Ruston 3 weeks earlier, Margaret had become the unofficial voice of the German women, the one who expressed their shared sense of displacement and cultural superiority. It was a role she'd fallen into naturally, built on her professional credentials and her inability to accept that defeat might mean learning from the victors. The mess hall buzzed with German conversations, women comparing this latest meal to what they had eaten back home. Some discussed the dark rye bread they missed, others the proper sauerbraten their mothers had made. Several reminisced about peacetime Sunday dinners that seemed like distant dreams now. Margaret pushed the hamburger to the edge of her plate, focusing instead on the other items. Green beans that were adequately prepared, potato salad that was acceptable though too sweet for her taste, and corn on the cob that reminded her why Germans fed corn primarily to livestock. She ate carefully, maintaining the posture and precision that had been drilled into her during her cooking training. Across the hall, she noticed that a few of the younger German women were actually trying to eat the hamburgers. Anneliese Weber, sitting 3 tables away, had taken a small bite and was chewing with an expression that looked suspiciously like surprise rather than disgust. This troubled Margaret. If the younger prisoners started accepting American food without resistance, it would undermine the cultural unity she'd been trying to maintain. "Anneliese," Margaret called out in German, her voice sharp enough to cut through the dining hall chatter. "You are actually eating that?" The young radio operator looked up, caught between embarrassment and defiance. At 23, she was nearly 15 years younger than Margaret and clearly intimidated by the older woman's authority. "It is not as bad as it appears, Frau Hauptmann. Different, yes, but the meat is fresh and well seasoned." "Fresh meat does not excuse poor technique," Margaret replied coldly. "A properly trained cook would never reduce quality beef to ground paste. It is wasteful and primitive." But even as she spoke, Margaret caught the aroma drifting from Annalise's table. Charred beef with notes of pepper and smoke, the tangy sweetness of the sauce, the yeasty warmth of fresh bread. Her stomach responded with an involuntary flutter of interest that she quickly pushed down. She had not survived 12 years in professional kitchens by letting basic hunger override her refined judgment. As the meal ended and the women filed out into the harsh Louisiana afternoon, Margaret overheard fragments of conversation that disturbed her carefully maintained story. Some of the younger prisoners were discussing the hamburger with something approaching appreciation. A few admitted they had enjoyed it. One even suggested it reminded her of a dish her grandmother used to make, though simplified. That evening, lying in her bunk in the women's barracks, Margaret found herself troubled by thoughts she didn't want to entertain. The hamburger had been objectively well prepared, the meat cooked to proper temperature, the vegetables fresh, the bread soft without being soggy. These were technical achievements she would have praised in a German kitchen. But admitting that Americans understood anything about cooking would mean acknowledging that perhaps her assumptions about American cultural inferiority were built on propaganda rather than truth. The question haunted her in the darkness. If she was wrong about American food, what else might she be wrong about? The thought was more terrifying than captivity itself, because it suggested that everything she'd believed about German superiority, everything that had given her identity meaning during the chaos of war and defeat, might be nothing more than comfortable lies. But 3 days later, something would happen at the outdoor grill behind the mess hall that would force Margaret to confront an uncomfortable truth. What if everything she'd learned about cooking sophistication in Berlin had blinded her to a different kind of genius? What if the Americans, with their simple ingredients and straightforward techniques, understood something about food that German complexity had missed? The transformation began not with surrender, but with a single reluctant bite that would change everything she believed about cooking, culture, and the enemy who had defeated her nation. The following morning brought another confrontation with the offensive American food. Margaret descended from her bunk with the rigid posture of someone determined to maintain standards in uncivilized circumstances. The barracks were already stirring, 40 women preparing for another day of captivity, another day of navigating the strange customs of their captors. Breakfast at Camp Ruston proved to be yet another assault on German sensibilities. Alongside scrambled eggs and bacon that Margaret grudgingly admitted were well prepared, the Americans served something they called hash browns, shredded potatoes fried until golden. It was peasant food, Margaret thought, but she noticed that several women were eating it with evident enjoyment. "Margarete," said Helga Zimmermann quietly, sitting beside Margaret at their usual table, "I tried the hamburger yesterday evening at dinner. You should taste it before continuing to judge." Margaret turned sharply to face her friend, betrayal stinging more than the words themselves. "You, Helga, you have forgotten your training?" "I have forgotten nothing," Helga replied calmly. "But I'm also remembering something my grandfather once told me, that pride makes poor seasoning. The hamburger was actually quite good. Not German, certainly, but good in its own way." Around the mess hall, similar conversations were unfolding. The younger women, less attached to rigid food prejudices, or perhaps simply more adaptable, had begun tentatively embracing American cuisine. Their reactions suggested that the food wasn't quite the cooking disaster Margaret had proclaimed. Nurse Petra Vogel was teaching others at her table to add extra pickles and mustard to their hamburgers, creating small variations that personalized the experience. Radio operator Annalisa Weber had discovered that the Americans made different styles, some with cheese melted on top, others with bacon added, variations that suggested more sophistication than Margaret had credited. "This is betrayal of our culture," Margaret muttered, pushing her hash browns around her plate. "This is survival," Helga countered gently. "We are prisoners in a foreign land. The war's lost, Margaret. Must we also lose our ability to adapt?" The words hit harder than intended. Margaret had spent the weeks since capture clinging to the belief that maintaining German standards was a form of resistance, a way of proving that defeat hadn't broken their spirit. But watching the other women gradually accept American hospitality, she began to wonder if her resistance was actually strength or simply stubbornness, pretending to be principle. That afternoon, during the daily orientation session, Captain Elizabeth Morrison addressed the food situation with unusual directness. She was a stern-faced woman in her 40s who commanded respect through competence rather than warmth. "Ladies," Morrison began in formal German that suggested military language training, "I understand many of you find American cuisine unfamiliar. In Germany, food traditions emphasize complexity and specific techniques. Here in America, particularly in the South, we value freshness, simplicity, and honest flavors. Neither approach is superior. They are simply different expressions of the same goal: feeding people well." She gestured to a chart showing American agricultural production. "This country produces more beef per person than any nation on earth. The hamburger isn't primitive, it's practical. It takes quality ground beef, forms it into patties that cook evenly, and serves it in a way that highlights the meat's natural flavor. Your German tradition of schnitzel does something similar with veal. Different techniques, same principle. Respect the ingredients." Margaret wanted to object, to argue that German cuisine's complexity represented higher cultural achievement, but the words stuck in her throat. Morrison's explanation made uncomfortable sense, suggesting that perhaps the hamburger wasn't evidence of American ignorance, but rather a different kind of wisdom. After the session, Lieutenant Mitchell approached Margaret directly. "Frau Hauptmann von Steinberg, I understand you manage officers' dining facilities in France." "Yes," Margaret replied stiffly in English, "for 3 years." "Then you understand kitchen operations, proper preparation, the importance of technique?" Mitchell paused, measuring her words carefully. "I'd like to invite you to visit our kitchen tomorrow, not to cook, just to observe how we prepare the hamburgers. Maybe you'll understand them better if you see the process." The invitation was clever, Margaret recognized, appealing to her professional curiosity while offering a face-saving way to learn about the despised food. It suggested Mitchell understood that Margaret's resistance came from pride rather than genuine disgust. "I will come," Margaret said finally, "but I make no promises about changing my opinion." "Fair enough, ma'am. Fair enough." That evening, Margaret lay in her bunk, listening to the other women discuss the day's developments. The conversation had shifted dramatically from mockery to cautious appreciation and even some enthusiasm. "The hamburger with cheese at dinner was excellent," admitted someone from across the barracks. "I asked for a second one," confessed another voice, barely audible. The American guard seemed pleased. "Has anyone else noticed we are gaining weight?" asked Greta Hoffman from the bunk below Margaret's. "After months of strict rationing in Germany, the American portions are substantial." Margaret touched her own waist, feeling the small but noticeable difference that 3 weeks of American food had created. She'd been dangerously thin when captured, as most German civilians were by the war's end. The abundant American meals, even the despised hamburgers, were restoring her health whether she admitted it or not. The question now wasn't whether American food was adequate. Clearly it was. The real question was whether her pride would prevent her from admitting that these supposedly backward Americans might understand something about cuisine that sophisticated Germans had overlooked. Through the barracks window, she could see the outdoor grill area where the Americans sometimes prepared meals in warm weather. Tomorrow, Lieutenant Mitchell would show her the hamburger preparation process, and Margaret would be forced to evaluate American cooking with professional honesty rather than patriotic prejudice. The thought both intrigued and terrified her. What if the Americans really did know what they were doing? What if their simple, direct approach to cooking represented not ignorance but clarity? What if she'd been wrong? Sleep came slowly that night, troubled by questions that challenged everything she'd built her identity around. In the darkness, she could still smell the ghost of that hamburger aroma: charred beef, melted cheese, tangy sauce, and her traitorous stomach rumbled its interest despite her mind's resistance. Saturday's cookout loomed 3 days away, and Margaret sensed that something significant would happen there, something that would force her to choose between comfortable prejudice and uncomfortable truth. The Americans were planning something special. She'd heard, an outdoor event where they'd demonstrate what they called authentic American grilling. Part of her wanted to refuse to attend, to maintain her resistance through absence. But a deeper, more honest part of her professional soul whispered that she needed to see this, needed to understand what these Americans were doing with their simple ingredients and straightforward techniques. needed to know if her contempt was justified or if she'd been blind to a different kind of cooking excellence all along. The answer would come soon enough, served hot off the grill with all the fixings, challenging every assumption she'd carried into captivity. And Margaret suspected, though she wouldn't admit it even to herself, that she wasn't ready for the lesson that awaited her. The kitchen at dawn proved to be a revelation. Margaret had expected a basic space focused on efficiency over quality, perhaps staffed by untrained cooks who followed recipes without understanding principles. Instead, she found herself standing in a professionally organized facility that would have impressed even her exacting father, who'd run a Michelin-starred restaurant in Berlin before the war. "Welcome to my domain," Lieutenant Mitchell said with obvious pride, gesturing around the spotless kitchen. The morning light streamed through high windows, illuminating stainless steel surfaces that gleamed from careful care. "We prepare 3 meals daily for 320 people. Everything's made fresh." Margaret studied the setup with her professional eye. Industrial ovens arranged for optimal workflow, multiple prep stations organized by function, ingredient storage that followed proper rotation principles. The organization spoke of someone who understood not just cooking, but kitchen management at a sophisticated level. "This is impressive," Margaret admitted reluctantly. "Thank you, ma'am," Mitchell replied. "Now let me show you how we prepare proper hamburgers." Mitchell moved to a large refrigerator and retrieved a substantial cut of beef. "This is fresh chuck, delivered yesterday from a local ranch. 80% lean, 20% fat. The ratio is crucial. Too lean and the burger becomes dry, too much fat and it falls apart during cooking." She began grinding the meat using a hand-crank grinder, her movements practiced and efficient. Margaret watched the muscle work, the way Mitchell fed the meat at a steady pace, keeping the grind consistent. It was technique, real technique, not the mindless food preparation Margaret had assumed Americans practice. "In Germany," Margaret said slowly, "we use ground meat for frikadellen, but we mix it with bread soaked in milk, eggs, onions. We add complexity." "And those are delicious," Mitchell replied without defensiveness. "But hamburgers follow a different philosophy. Let the beef speak for itself. Season it simply, cook it properly, let the quality of the meat shine through." The words struck Margaret with unexpected force. She'd spent years learning to build layers of flavor, to construct elaborate dishes where technique obscured the base ingredients. The idea that simplicity might be its own form of sophistication had never occurred to her. Mitchell formed the ground beef into patties with practiced hands, her movements gentle. "Common mistake is overworking the meat. Handle it too much and it becomes dense, tough. You want to form it just enough to hold together, then stop," she demonstrated, creating a patty with a slight depression in the center. The dimple prevents bulging during cooking. Margaret leaned closer, fascinated. This wasn't crude food preparation. This was craft. "Seasoning comes next," Mitchell continued, sprinkling salt and black pepper on both sides. "Simple, but timing matters. Salt too early and it draws out moisture. Salt just before cooking and it enhances flavor without compromising texture." She moved to a large cast iron griddle already heated to proper temperature. A small piece of butter sizzled on the surface. "The griddle needs to be hot enough to create a proper crust immediately. That crust seals in juices and creates flavor through the Maillard reaction." Mitchell glanced at Margaret. "You know this term?" "Yes," Margaret replied. "The browning reaction between amino acids and sugars. We learned this in cooking school." "Exactly, same science, different application." Mitchell placed the patties on the griddle where they immediately began to sizzle. The aroma hit Margaret like a physical force. Beef browning at ideal temperature, fat rendering into the meat, pepper toasting on the surface. Her mouth watered involuntarily, and she swallowed hard, angry at her body's betrayal. "Timing is everything," Mitchell narrated. 3 minutes on the first side for medium. Don't press down on the meat. That squeezes out the juices. Let the heat do its work." Margaret found herself nodding, drawn in despite her resistance. This was cooking, real cooking, stripped of pretension, but no less skilled for its simplicity. "Now we flip," Mitchell said, using a wide spatula to turn each patty in one smooth motion. "One flip only. Let each side develop its crust properly. The cooked side displayed perfect grill marks, dark brown, almost to black where the meat had made full contact. The color told Margaret everything. This was properly executed cooking, achieving the browning that created deep, complex flavors. While the second side cooked, Mitchell prepared the accompaniments with equal care. She sliced tomatoes to exact thickness, washed lettuce leaves and dried them properly, cut onions into rings. She toasted buns on a separate part of the griddle until they achieved light golden color. The bun matters more than people think, Mitchell explained. Too soft and it becomes soggy. Too hard and it overwhelms the meat. These are potato buns, slight sweetness, soft but with enough structure. The toasting creates a barrier that slows juice absorption. In the final minute, Mitchell added cheese slices to half the patties. They melted slowly, draping over the meat. American cheese, Margaret noted. The processed product she dismissed as artificial. Yet watching it melt perfectly, creating a creamy layer that would bind the other ingredients, she understood its purpose. Mitchell assembled the hamburgers with attention to detail. Bottom bun, light spread of mayonnaise and mustard, lettuce leaf, tomato slice, the perfectly cooked patty with its cheese blanket, onion rings, top bun. The construction showed thought. Wet ingredients separated from the bun by lettuce, flavors distributed to balance each bite. She plated 2 hamburgers and handed one to Margaret with a challenge in her eyes. Judge it as a professional, ma'am, not as a German who's been told American food is inferior. Evaluate the technique, the execution, the respect for ingredients. Margaret stared at the hamburger in her hands. Perfectly constructed, still warm, juices beginning to soak into the toasted bun. Every instinct told her to refuse on principle, but her professional curiosity demanded honest evaluation. The hamburger felt substantial in Margaret's hands, heavier than she'd expected. Heat radiated through the paper wrapping, and the aroma enveloped her. Beef, cheese, tangy sauce, toasted bread, combining into something that bypassed her rational mind and spoke directly to instincts she'd been suppressing for 3 weeks. She lifted it slowly, aware that Lieutenant Mitchell was watching, aware that this moment carried weight beyond simple eating. This was about whether pride could survive contact with honest evaluation. The first bite surprised her with its complexity. The texture came first, the slight resistance of the toasted bun giving way to tender beef, creamy cheese, crisp lettuce, all layered to create contrast within a single mouthful. Then the flavors, rich, savory beef with charred exterior notes, subtle sweetness of the potato bun, tangy brightness of mustard cutting through richness, mellow cheese binding everything together. It was, objectively speaking, delicious. Margaret chewed slowly, her trained palate analyzing every element, while her mind struggled to reconcile what she was tasting with what she'd believed. The beef was perfectly cooked, with proper crust that provided textural interest in concentrated flavor. The seasoning was restrained but effective, enhancing rather than masking the meat's natural taste. This wasn't crude food. This was the result of understanding ingredients, respecting technique, and executing with precision. It was everything good cooking should be, just expressed through a different culinary vocabulary than the one she'd been taught to value. "Well?" Mitchell asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Margaret swallowed, struggling to find words that would acknowledge truth without completely surrendering her sense of identity. "It is." She paused, the German part of her mind screaming betrayal. "It is actually quite good. Different from German preparations, but good. Very good." The admission felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders, even as another heaviness settled in, recognizing how much she'd been wrong about, how much her prejudice had blinded her. Mitchell smiled genuinely. "Ma'am, I think you just learned something important about keeping an open mind." Margaret took another bite, this time without internal resistance, allowing herself to simply experience the food. It was even better the second time. The flavors seemed to develop and change as she chewed, the char notes giving way to beef sweetness, the cheese providing creamy foundation, the acid elements brightening everything. "The technique is sound," Margaret said, falling back on professional language. "The meat handling, the temperature control, the construction, all properly executed. The ingredients are quality, the proportions balanced. This is skilled cooking, just in a style I was not trained to appreciate. That's all it ever was, Mitchell replied. Not better or worse than German cooking, just different. Hamburgers came from German immigrants, actually. They took the concept from Hamburg and adapted it to American conditions. Evolution, not revolution. The historical connection startled Margaret. She'd been so busy dismissing American food as inferior that she'd never considered it might have European roots, transformed by new circumstances into something serving different purposes. She finished the first hamburger and found herself eyeing the second one Mitchell had prepared. The realization that she wanted more, that she was genuinely hungry for this food she'd been mocking, felt like a fundamental shift. "May I?" she asked, gesturing at the second burger. "Please," Mitchell encouraged. As Margaret ate the second hamburger, she found herself thinking about everything else she might have been wrong about. If her assumptions about American food were this mistaken, what about her assumptions about American culture more broadly? About the people who defeated Germany? About the society that could feed its prisoners better than Germany had fed its own citizens? The thoughts were uncomfortable, threatening the entire structure of belief she'd used to make sense of her world. But they were also oddly liberating, suggesting that perhaps defeat didn't mean the end of everything, but rather an opportunity to learn things that German victory would have prevented her from understanding. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Margaret said slowly, "I owe you an apology. I judged without knowledge, criticized without understanding. As a professional, I should have known better." Mitchell waved off the apology. "What matters is being willing to change your mind when evidence contradicts belief. That takes courage." The two women stood in the quiet kitchen, morning sun fully illuminating the space, smell of grilled beef lingering. Margaret felt something shift inside her, some rigid structure of belief beginning to crack and rearrange into more flexible form. "I need to tell the other women," Margaret said suddenly. "They look to me for guidance, and I have been guiding them poorly." "You'll have your chance on Saturday," Mitchell replied with a knowing smile. "Captain Morrison approved my request for an outdoor cookout. I was hoping you might help me present it. Maybe explain what you've learned about the techniques involved." The invitation would transform her from opponent to advocate, use her authority to break down the resistance she'd helped create. It would force her to publicly admit she'd been wrong, to stand before the women who'd followed her lead, and tell them that the American food they'd been mocking deserved their respect. The prospect terrified her, but it also felt necessary. Word spread through Camp Ruston with peculiar speed. By lunchtime, every German woman knew that Frau Hauptmann, Margaret von Steinberg, had not only tried a hamburger, but had returned from the kitchen praising Lieutenant Mitchell's technique. The dining hall buzzed with German conversations that stopped abruptly whenever Margaret entered. She could feel the eyes on her, the mixture of curiosity, betrayal, and cautious hope. She took her usual seat, but the dynamic had changed. She was no longer the unquestioned voice of German superiority, but something more complicated. Someone who'd crossed a line and returned changed. "Margaret," Helga Zimmerman said quietly, sliding into the seat beside her, "the women are confused. They need to understand what happened this morning." Margaret looked at her plate. Today's lunch included hamburgers again, and this time she didn't push hers aside. Instead, she picked it up deliberately, aware that dozens of eyes watched. She took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and nodded with professional approval. "What happened," Margaret said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "is that I stopped letting pride interfere with honest evaluation. I watched Lieutenant Mitchell prepare hamburgers with proper technique, quality ingredients, and genuine skill. I tasted the result with an open mind, and I discovered that I had been wrong." The hall had gone quiet, women straining to hear this unprecedented admission. "I was wrong," Margaret repeated, the words coming easier. "I judged American cooking without understanding it, dismissed food I refused to taste. As a professional, this was inexcusable. I'm telling you now, the American hamburger, when properly prepared, is genuinely good food. Different from what we know, yes, but good." Nurse Petra Vogel spoke up from a nearby table, her voice tentative. "So we are permitted to enjoy it without feeling we are betraying our culture?" "You are encouraged," Margaret replied firmly. Appreciating good food from another culture doesn't diminish our heritage. It demonstrates that we are educated enough to recognize quality wherever we find it. The atmosphere shifted noticeably. Women who'd been eating their hamburgers with guilty secrecy now did so openly. Others, who'd been resisting, picked up the food they'd been avoiding and took exploratory bites. Permission had been granted to stop fighting a battle that had made no sense to many of them. The next 2 days passed in curious transition. Margaret found herself spending more time in the kitchen, learning American cooking methods. Mitchell taught her about different regional hamburger styles. In return, Margaret began teaching Mitchell some German techniques, demonstrating proper schnitzel preparation and German potato salad. "This is incredible," Mitchell said, tasting the potato salad. "It's like the same destination reached by different roads. American potato salad uses mayonnaise for richness. Yours uses vinegar and gets richness from bacon fat. Both work, just different philosophies." The exchange felt significant, like something being built between former enemies that transcended the war. Food was becoming a bridge where politics had constructed walls. But that evening, a letter arrived through Red Cross channels that shattered Margaret's growing peace. Her younger sister, Katharina, wrote from Berlin in handwriting that trembled with desperation. "Margaret, we are starving. The ration cards buy almost nothing. Yesterday, 150 grams of bread mixed with sawdust, no butter, no meat for 3 weeks. Mother grows weaker daily. The children cry from hunger. I do not begrudge you eating well. But I cannot pretend it doesn't hurt. I pray you are safe and that someday we will eat a meal together again." Margaret read the letter twice, 3 times each reading, making the contrast more devastating. She was a prisoner eating better than free German civilians. She'd gained weight while her family starved. She'd been arguing about hamburger quality while her mother weakened from malnutrition. She sat on her bunk, the letter trembling in her hands, and felt something break inside her. All her concerns about cooking sophistication suddenly seemed obscenely trivial. Her sister needed food, any food, and would have wept with gratitude for the hamburgers Margaret had been mocking. Helga found her there an hour later, still holding the letter. Without a word, Helga read what Katharina had written, then sat beside Margaret in heavy silence. "The Americans feed prisoners like honored guests while German civilians starve," Margaret said bitterly. "A world where the side that wins determines who eats," Helga replied quietly. "But also a world where that says something important about which side deserved to win. That the Americans treat even their enemies better than our government treated its own people. That tells you something about the systems we were fighting for." "I need to help them," Margaret said. "Katharina, my mother, the children, they need to come here." "Then prove you've adapted successfully," Helga advised. "Saturday's cookout isn't just about hamburgers. It's about demonstrating that Germans can work with Americans, learn from them, build something new, do that well enough, and maybe you create opportunities for family reunification." Saturday's event was no longer just about food. It was about building bridges that might literally save her family's lives, about proving that former enemies could become valued community members. Saturday arrived with perfect summer weather. Behind the mess hall, American guards had set up 2 large charcoal grills, tables laden with ingredients, and seating for everyone. Margaret stood beside Lieutenant Mitchell as the women filed out. Captain Morrison opened with brief remarks. "Ladies, today is about understanding that different cultures solve similar problems in different ways." Margaret stepped forward. 3 weeks ago, I declared that American hamburgers were peasant food. I was wrong because I let pride blind me to truth." Together, Mitchell worked the grill while Margaret provided commentary in German. "Watch how she handles the meat. Gentle touch, minimal handling. This is the same principle we use for making meatballs." The sizzle and aroma made women lean forward unconsciously. Mitchell flipped the burgers, revealing perfectly browned surfaces. Margaret took the first completed burger, held it up, and bit into it. "It is excellent. This is good cooking by any standard." As burgers were served, transformation unfolded. First bites brought surprise. Second bites brought acceptance. The atmosphere shifted from demonstration to celebration. Later, Captain Morrison approached Margaret privately. "That was exceptional work today." Margaret pulled out Katharina's letter. "My sister and her family are starving in Berlin. I want to apply for family reunification. Morrison read the letter gravely. Your demonstration today will help your case considerably. 6 months later, Margaret watched her sister Katharina and 3 nieces taste their first American hamburgers. The girls, hollow-eyed and thin from Berlin, approached the food with desperate hunger. What is this, Tante Margaret? Emma asked. This is what I once called peasant food because I was too proud to taste it. Now I call it delicious. Katharina sat beside her, tears streaming. I cannot believe this is real. I know, Margaret replied quietly. And that contrast taught me more about which system deserved to win than any propaganda ever could. The hamburger she'd mocked had become her teacher, showing her that true strength meant admitting when you were wrong, and that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single honest bite.